The desert sun beat down on Thomas Mackenzie's back as he walked through the dusty streets of Tucson in 1882. His boots had holes in them, and his shirt was stained with sweat and dirt. Tom hadn't eaten a proper meal in 3 days. His stomach growled loudly as he passed the local saloon. Tom used to be a prospector, searching for gold and silver in the Arizona mountains. He had big dreams back then. He thought he'd strike it rich and live like a king, but after 2 years of digging holes and finding nothing but rocks, his savings were gone. His tools were sold. All he had left was his old horse, Daisy, and exactly $1 silver in his pocket. The problem was much bigger than being poor. Tom owed money to Big Jim Hartwell, the man who owned the biggest saloon in town. Jim was not the kind of man you wanted to owe money to. He was tall, mean, and had fists like hammers. People whispered that men who couldn't pay Jim back sometimes disappeared into the desert and were never seen again. Tom had borrowed $200 from Jim 6 months ago. He promised to pay it back when he found gold, but there was no gold. Now Jim wanted his money and he wanted it fast. This morning, Jim had grabbed Tom by his shirt and pulled him close. His breath smelled like whiskey and tobacco. "You got 24 hours, Mackenzie," Jim had growled. "Bring me my $200 or I'll take it out of your hide. And trust me, that won't be pleasant for you." Tom's hands shook as he remembered those words. Where could he get $200? That was more money than most people in town made in 6 months. He thought about running away, but where would he go? The desert was dangerous and he had no supplies. As he walked past the general store, lost in his worried thoughts, a man called out to him in broken English mixed with Spanish. The man was short and stocky, with dark skin and a large hat. He had a wagon full of goods covered with blankets. "You look like man with troubles, friend," the trader said with a thick accent. "Maybe I help you?" Tom stopped walking. He was so desperate that he would listen to anyone who might have a solution. "I doubt you can help me with my kind of trouble," Tom said sadly. The trader smiled and walked closer. "I know many men like you. Men who owe money to dangerous people. Men who need fast solution." He looked around to make sure no one was listening. "I have special deal." "Very special?" Tom raised an eyebrow. In his experience, special deals usually meant trouble. But what choice did he have? "What kind of deal?" The trader led Tom behind his wagon away from the main street. He pulled back one of the blankets. Inside the wagon, Tom saw a young woman. She was Apache with long black hair and dark skin. Her hands were tied and she looked scared. She couldn't have been older than 19 or 20. Tom's heart sank. He knew this was wrong. Everything about this situation screamed danger and trouble. But the trader kept talking. "This girl, she worth much money. Apache people, they work hard. She cook, she clean, she do whatever you need. I take your horse and your dollar and she yours. Then you sell her to Big Jim for $3, maybe $400. You pay your debt and have money left over." Tom stared at the girl. She looked back at him with eyes full of fear and anger. She said something in Apache that he couldn't understand, but her tone made it clear she was not happy about this situation. Tom knew this was human trafficking. He knew it was wrong. His mother had raised him to be better than this. But Big Jim's threat echoed in his mind. 24 hours, $200 or else. Tom looked at his old horse Daisy, then at his last silver dollar. This trader was offering him what seemed like the only way out of his problem. The trader pressed him. "You think too much, friend. Opportunity like this not come again. You want to be dead man tomorrow, or you want to be free man?" Tom's mind raced. He thought about his debt to Jim. He thought about what might happen to him if he couldn't pay. He thought about his empty stomach and his hopeless future. In that moment of desperation and panic, Tom made the worst decision of his life. "All right," he whispered. "I'll do it." The trader smiled widely and shook Tom's hand. Within minutes, the deal was done. The trader took Daisy and Tom's silver dollar. In return, he gave Tom a piece of paper that he claimed proved ownership of the girl, though Tom suspected the paper was fake. As the trader drove away with Daisy, Tom looked at the young Apache woman. She was now his responsibility, bought with his last possessions. The weight of what he had just done began to sink in. He had traded away his horse and his last money for a human being. He had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The girl stood silently, her hands still tied. She watched Tom with a mixture of hatred and fear. She was probably wondering what kind of man would buy another person like she was a piece of property. Tom was wondering the same thing about himself. As they walked toward his small cabin outside of town, Tom realized he didn't even know her name. He had bought a person whose name he didn't know, whose language he didn't speak, whose life he had just taken control of. The desert wind blew dust around them as they walked in uncomfortable silence. Tom's cabin was small and run down. It had one room, a broken window, and a roof that leaked when it rained. It wasn't much, but it was all he had. As they reached the door, Tom turned to look at the girl one more time. In her eyes, he saw something that made his stomach turn with guilt. She wasn't just scared anymore. She was looking at him like he was a monster. Maybe he was becoming one. The thought scared him more than Big Jim's threats ever could. But it was too late now. The deal was done, and tomorrow he would have to figure out what to do next. As the sun set over the Arizona desert, Tom Mackenzie realized that trying to solve one problem had created a much bigger one. He just didn't know yet how much this decision would change everything. Tom's cabin felt smaller than ever with another person inside. The Apache girl sat in the far corner, as far away from him as possible. She hadn't spoken a single word since they arrived. Tom had untied her hands, but she kept rubbing her wrists where the ropes had been. Her dark eyes followed his every movement like she was watching a dangerous animal. Tom didn't know what to say or do. He had never owned another person before. The whole situation felt wrong and strange. He kept thinking about what his mother would say if she could see him now. She had taught him to treat all people with respect and kindness. This was the opposite of everything she had raised him to believe. The girl's clothes were torn and dirty. She looked like she hadn't eaten in days. Tom realized she was probably hungry and thirsty, just like he had been. He went to his small food supply and pulled out some dried meat and a piece of stale bread. It wasn't much, but it was half of everything he had left. He held the food out to her. She stared at it for a long time, then looked up at his face. Tom could see her trying to figure out if this was some kind of trick. Finally, hunger won over suspicion. She took the food and ate it quickly, like someone who hadn't seen a meal in a very long time. "Water?" Tom asked, pointing to his water barrel. The girl didn't understand English, but she understood the gesture. She nodded slightly. Tom brought her a cup of water, and she drank it all in one long gulp. As the night went on, Tom tried to learn something about her. He pointed to himself and said Tom several times. Then he pointed to her with a questioning look. She was quiet for a long time. Finally, she spoke one word. "Ayanna." Tom repeated the name, trying to get it right. Ayanna. She nodded when he said it correctly. It was their first real communication, and it felt important somehow. The next morning, Tom woke up early. He expected to find Ayanna still in the corner where she had been the night before. Instead, she was gone. His heart jumped with panic. Had she run away? Would she bring her tribe back to get revenge on him? Tom rushed outside to look for her. He found her behind the cabin, kneeling next to a small plant. She was examining it carefully, touching its leaves and smelling it. When she saw Tom, she stood up quickly and stepped back. But she didn't run away. Tom noticed that she had cleaned herself up somehow. Her face was washed, and she had braided her long black hair. She looked more alert and strong than she had the night before. There was something different about the way she carried herself, too. She didn't look as scared anymore. Instead, she looked like she was planning something. Over the next few days, Tom began to notice things about Ayanna that surprised him. She was incredibly smart and observant. While he thought she was just sitting quietly, she was actually studying everything around her. She watched how he cooked his food, where he got his water, and how he tried to fix things around the cabin. But more than that, she seemed to know things about living in the desert that Tom had never learned. When he struggled to start a fire with damp wood, she showed him which dry materials to use instead. She didn't speak English, but she could communicate with her hands and gestures. One morning, Tom woke up to find that Ayanna had reorganized his entire food supply. She had separated the good food from the spoiled food, and had arranged everything in a way that made more sense. She had also found sources of water that Tom didn't even know existed near his cabin. Tom began to realize that the trader had been wrong about one thing. Ayanna wasn't helpless or dependent. She was incredibly capable. In fact, she seemed to know more about surviving in this harsh desert environment than Tom did, even though he had lived here for 2 years. One afternoon, Tom cut his hand badly while trying to fix his broken window. Blood was flowing freely and he couldn't get it to stop. He was starting to panic when Ayanna stepped forward. She gestured for him to sit down and let her see the wound. From somewhere in her torn dress, she pulled out a small pouch. Inside were dried plants and herbs that Tom had never seen before. She mixed some of the herbs with water and made a paste. When she put it on Tom's cut, the bleeding stopped almost immediately. She wrapped his hand with a clean strip of cloth that she had somehow found or made. The pain went away quickly, too. Tom stared at his bandaged hand in amazement. In all his time in Arizona, he had never seen medicine work so fast and so well. That evening, as Tom looked at his properly bandaged hand, he began to see Ayanna differently. She wasn't the helpless person he had thought he was buying. She was a skilled, intelligent woman who knew things he could only dream of knowing. For the first time since making the trade, Tom started to feel something besides guilt. He felt curious. Who was this woman? What was her life like before she was captured? What other things did she know that could help both of them survive in this difficult place? But along with curiosity came an even stronger feeling of shame. He had treated another human being like property. He had reduced a capable, intelligent person to something that could be bought and sold. The more he learned about Ayanna's skills and intelligence, the worse he felt about what he had done. As Tom lay down to sleep that night, he listened to Ayanna breathing quietly in her corner of the cabin. Tomorrow he knew he would have to face Big Jim and figure out what to do about his debt. But tonight he was thinking about something else entirely. He was thinking about how wrong he had been about everything. About Ayanna, about himself, and about what it meant to be a decent human being. The woman in the corner of his cabin wasn't his property. She was his teacher, whether she knew it or not. And the lessons she was teaching him had nothing to do with desert survival, and everything to do with who he wanted to be as a person. Tom fell asleep that night with a new understanding growing in his mind. He had made a terrible mistake, but maybe it wasn't too late to find a way to make things right. The next few days brought changes that Tom never expected. Each morning he woke up to discover that Ayanna had improved something around the cabin while he slept. She worked quietly and efficiently, never asking for permission or explanation. On the third morning, Tom found that she had created a small garden behind the cabin. She had planted seeds from desert plants that he didn't even recognize. When he looked confused, she pointed to her stomach and then to the plants. She was showing him that these plants would provide food. Tom was amazed. In 2 years of living in Arizona, he had never thought to grow his own food. He had always depended on the expensive supplies from the general store in town. But here was Ayanna, creating a food source from nothing but knowledge and hard work. Later that day, Tom's water supply ran dangerously low. This was always his biggest fear in the desert. Without water, a person could die in just a few days under the Arizona sun. Tom began to panic, wondering if he should make the long, dangerous trip to town to buy more water. But Ayanna watched his worried behavior and seemed to understand the problem. She gestured for him to follow her. She led him to a spot about 100 yards from the cabin where Tom had never paid much attention. The ground looked the same as everywhere else to him. Ayanna knelt down and began digging with her hands. She dug down about 3 feet before Tom saw something that made his eyes widen with surprise. Water began to seep into the hole. Within an hour, they had a small but steady source of clean, fresh water. Tom couldn't believe it. How had she known the water was there? He had walked past that spot hundreds of times and never suspected anything. When he looked at her with wonder and gratitude, she simply smiled slightly and walked back to the cabin. That evening, as they shared another simple meal, Tom tried to communicate his amazement. He pointed to the water hole, then to her, then made gestures that he hoped showed how impressed he was. Ayanna watched his clumsy attempts at sign language and laughed softly. It was the first time Tom had heard her laugh, and the sound surprised him with how normal and human it was. Over the following days, the lessons continued. Ayanna showed Tom which desert plants were safe to eat and which ones were poisonous. She taught him how to read the sky to predict weather changes. She demonstrated how to track animals by following their footprints and droppings. Most importantly, she taught him how to move quietly and efficiently through the desert landscape. Tom had always crashed through the desert like a bull, making noise and wasting energy. But Ayanna moved like she was part of the environment itself, stepping carefully and observing everything around her. One morning, Tom woke up to find fresh rabbit meat cooking over the fire. Ayanna had somehow caught and prepared an entire rabbit while he slept. When Tom looked around for traps or weapons, he found an ingenious snare made from plant fibers, and positioned perfectly near a rabbit trail that he had never even noticed. The more Tom learned from Ayanna, the more he realized how little he actually knew about survival. He had been living in the desert for 2 years, but he had been living like a visitor, not like someone who belonged there. Ayanna lived like the desert was her home because it was. But the lessons weren't just about practical skills. Tom began to notice how Ayanna approached problems differently than he did. When something went wrong, Tom usually got angry and frustrated. He would curse and throw things and make the situation worse. Ayanna never lost her temper. When a problem came up, she would sit quietly and think about it. She would study the situation from different angles before taking action. Her solutions were usually simple, clever, and effective. Watching her calm approach to difficulties made Tom realize how much energy he wasted on anger and frustration. He began to try copying her method of thinking before acting. To his surprise, he found that many problems were easier to solve when he approached them with patience instead of emotion. As the days passed, Tom and Ayanna developed their own form of communication. She was starting to understand a few English words, and he was learning some basic Apache phrases. But more than words, they communicated through gestures, expressions, and shared experiences. Tom found himself looking forward to each day's new lessons. Every morning brought fresh discoveries about the desert, about survival, and about different ways of thinking about problems. For the first time in years, Tom felt like he was truly learning and growing as a person. But with this growth came an increasingly heavy weight of guilt. The more capable and intelligent Ayanna proved to be, the more horrible Tom felt about the way she had come to be in his cabin. He had traded for her like she was an object. But she was clearly a remarkable person with knowledge and skills that far exceeded his own. Late at night, Tom would lie awake thinking about her life before she was captured. She obviously came from a community where people knew how to live successfully in this harsh environment. She had family members who had taught her these skills. She had friends and responsibilities and a whole life that had been taken away from her. And he was part of that taking. Every day that she stayed in his cabin, every skill that she taught him, every moment that she couldn't return to her own people, was partly his fault. The knowledge that he was benefiting from her captivity made him feel sick. Tom began to understand that Ayanna wasn't just teaching him about desert survival. She was teaching him about dignity, resilience, and grace under pressure. She was showing him what it looked like to maintain your humanity even in an impossible situation. The more he learned from her, the more Tom realized that he needed to find a way to make this right. But he still didn't know how. His debt to Big Jim was still hanging over his head like a dark cloud. And he was beginning to suspect that his problems with Big Jim were about to get much worse. What Tom didn't know was that time was running out faster than he realized. Forces were already in motion that would soon test everything that Ayanna had taught him, and everything that he thought he understood about right and wrong. Tom was checking the rabbit snares that Ayanna had taught him to build when he heard horses approaching. The sound made his blood run cold. Out here in the desert, visitors usually meant trouble. He looked toward the cabin and saw Ayanna standing in the doorway, her body tense and alert. Big Jim Hartwell rode up with 3 of his men. They were all armed, and they looked like they meant business. Jim was even bigger and more intimidating than Tom remembered. His face was red from the desert sun and twisted with anger. Well, Mackenzie, Jim called out as he climbed down from his horse. Looks like you've been living pretty well out here while you owe me money. Tom's heart pounded, but he tried to keep his voice steady. Jim, I've been working on getting your money. I just need a little more time. Jim laughed, but it wasn't a friendly sound. Time? You've had plenty of time. Today's the day you pay up or face the consequences. His eyes moved past Tom to where Ayanna was standing. But I see you've got some interesting company. The way Jim looked at Ayanna made Tom's stomach turn. It was the same look a wolf might give a sheep. Jim walked past Tom toward the cabin, his men following behind. Now this is interesting, Jim said, studying Ayanna carefully. A pretty Apache girl, all the way out here. How did you come by her, Mackenzie? Tom's mouth went dry. He had hoped this moment would never come, but here it was. She's helping me with things around the place. Jim grinned widely. Helping you? That's real nice of her. He turned back to Tom. You know what? Maybe we can work out a deal after all. I'll take the girl as payment for your debt. She looks like she'd be worth at least $200. Maybe more. No. The word came out of Tom's mouth before he could stop it. All four men turned to stare at him in surprise. What did you say? Jim asked quietly. His voice was dangerous now. Tom looked at Ayanna. She was watching the conversation carefully, and even though she couldn't understand all the English words, she clearly understood what was happening. Her face was calm, but Tom could see the fear in her eyes. In that moment, something shifted inside Tom. All the lessons Ayanna had taught him over the past weeks came together in his mind. She had shown him what dignity looked like. She had demonstrated courage and intelligence and grace. She had treated him with more humanity than he had shown her, even after what he had done. I said no, Tom repeated louder this time. She's not for sale. Jim's face darkened. Not for sale? Boy, you seem to be forgetting that you owe me money. A lot of money. And I don't see any cash in your hands. I'll find another way to pay you, Tom said. But she's not part of any deal. One of Jim's men, a skinny man with a scar across his cheek, spoke up. Boss, maybe we should just take them both. Teach this fool a lesson about keeping his word. Jim considered this suggestion. You know, that might be the smart play here. He looked at Tom with cold eyes. You've disappointed me, Mackenzie. I gave you a fair chance to pay your debt like a man. Instead, you're out here playing house with an Indian girl and thinking you can dictate terms to me. Tom felt panic rising in his chest, but he also felt something else. For the first time in months, he felt like he was doing the right thing. Jim, let's talk about this, just you and me. There's got to be another way. Oh, there's another way, all right, Jim said. Here's what's going to happen. My boys and I are going to ride back to town now, but we're coming back tomorrow morning with more men. And when we come back, we're taking everything you've got. The girl, whatever supplies you've managed to scrape together, and probably you too. Consider it interest on your overdue debt. As Jim and his men mounted their horses, the scarred man called out, Better enjoy your last night, Mackenzie. Tomorrow's going to be a whole different kind of day. Tom watched them ride away until they disappeared over a hill. Only then did he realize his hands were shaking. He had just made an enemy of the most dangerous man in the territory, and he had absolutely no idea what to do about it. When he turned around, he found Ayanna standing right behind him. She had moved so quietly that he hadn't heard her approach. She looked into his eyes and spoke in Apache. He couldn't understand the words, but her tone was urgent and serious. She led him into the cabin and began drawing pictures in the dirt floor with a stick. First, she drew what looked like mountains. Then she drew figures that looked like people hiding in the mountains. She pointed to herself, then to the mountains, then to the people. Tom began to understand. She was telling him about her tribe. They were nearby, probably in the hills around his cabin. She drew more figures, showing them moving and watching. She was trying to tell him that her people knew where she was, but there was something else in her drawings too. She drew what looked like a plan. She showed the bad men coming back, but she also showed the hidden people in the mountains doing something about it. She was telling him that help was coming, but she was also telling him that tomorrow was going to bring changes that neither of them could control. That night, Tom couldn't sleep. He sat by the window, watching the darkness and thinking about everything that had happened. A week ago, his biggest problem had been owing money to Big Jim. Now he had discovered that doing the right thing was more complicated and more dangerous than he had ever imagined. But he didn't regret his decision to protect Ayanna. For the first time since making that terrible trade with the Mexican, Tom felt like he had acted with honor. Whatever happened tomorrow, at least he could face it knowing that he had finally chosen to be the man his mother had raised him to be. As dawn approached, Tom noticed something that made his heart race. There were shadows moving in the hills around his cabin. Shadows that looked like people watching and waiting. Ayanna had been right. Her people were here, and they had been watching all along. Tom realized that the events of the past week had been leading to this moment. Everything was about to change, and there was no going back to the way things were before. Tomorrow would bring a reckoning that would test everything he had learned about courage, honor, and what it truly meant to do the right thing. Tom barely slept that night. Every sound made him jump. The wind through the desert plants sounded like footsteps. The call of a night bird sounded like a signal. He kept looking out the window, trying to see the shadows that Ayanna had told him were watching from the hills. As the first light of dawn crept across the desert sky, Tom heard something that made his heart stop. It was a low whistle like a bird call, but different somehow. More purposeful. Ayanna sat up immediately when she heard it. She had been awake too. She went to the window and made a similar whistle sound back. Then she turned to Tom and spoke in Apache. Her voice was calm but urgent. She was preparing him for something, but he didn't know what. The answer came quickly. Tom looked outside and saw them. At least a dozen Apache warriors had surrounded his cabin during the night. They had been so quiet that even though Tom had been listening for them, he hadn't heard them approach. The warriors were armed with rifles, bows, and knives. Their faces were painted for war, but they weren't attacking. They were just standing there waiting for something to happen. Tom felt like a rabbit that had suddenly found itself surrounded by wolves. One of the warriors stepped forward from the group. He was tall and strong with long black hair and the same intelligent eyes as Ayanna. He spoke to her in rapid Apache. She responded, pointing toward Tom and gesturing in ways that seemed to be explaining something important. The conversation went on for several minutes. Tom could tell that Ayanna was doing most of the talking, and the warrior was listening carefully. Other warriors joined the conversation and their voices became more heated. Some of them kept looking at Tom with expressions that made him very nervous. Finally, Ayanna turned to Tom and spoke in the few English words she had learned. "Brother," she said, pointing to the tall warrior. Then she pointed to Tom and said something in Apache that sounded like a question. The warrior, who Tom now understood was Ayanna's brother, studied Tom's face carefully. He walked closer, close enough that Tom could see the war paint on his cheeks and the determination in his eyes. When he spoke, his English was broken but clear. "You are the man who bought my sister like she was a horse," he said. Tom's throat felt dry as sand. "Yes," he managed to whisper. "You traded for her with your horse and $1, the warrior continued. "Yes," Tom said again. There was no point in lying now. The brother turned and spoke to the other warriors in Apache. Tom couldn't understand the words, but he could hear anger and disgust in their voices. Several of them moved their hands toward their weapons. Tom was sure his life was about to end right there in front of his own cabin. But Ayanna spoke up again. She talked quickly and urgently, gesturing toward Tom and toward the direction where Big Jim and his men had disappeared the day before. She seemed to be telling them about what had happened when Jim wanted to take her as payment for the debt. The brother listened to everything she said. Then he asked her questions that she answered at length. Tom watched this conversation and realized that his life was being debated in a language he couldn't understand. Everything depended on what Ayanna chose to tell her brother about the past week. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the brother turned back to Tom. "My sister tells me you protected her yesterday. She says you chose to make an enemy of a dangerous man rather than sell her again." Tom nodded. "That's right. She also tells me you have learned from her, that you have changed from the man who bought her." Tom thought about this carefully. "She taught me things I never knew, about surviving in the desert, but also about being a better person. I'm not the same man who made that trade." The brother translated this for the other warriors. The discussion that followed was intense. Some of the warriors seemed to want immediate revenge. Others seemed more interested in what Ayanna was telling them about Tom's recent behavior. Finally, the brother held up his hand for silence. When he spoke to Tom again, his voice was serious but not threatening. "My sister says you are ashamed of what you did. Is this true?" "Yes," Tom said immediately. "It's the worst thing I've ever done. I knew it was wrong when I did it, but I was desperate and scared. That's no excuse, but it's the truth. And now? What would you do now if you could go back to that day?" Tom looked at Ayanna. She was watching him carefully, waiting to hear his answer. "I would have found another way." "Any other way? No person should be bought and sold like property. No matter how desperate I was, I should never have done that to another human being." The brother nodded slowly. He spoke to Ayanna in Apache, and she responded with what sounded like agreement. Then he turned back to the other warriors and gave what seemed to be a command. Several of them lowered their weapons, though they kept them ready. "We have been watching this place for many days," the brother told Tom. "We saw the bad men come here yesterday. We heard their threats. We know they will return today with more men." Tom's heart raced. If Big Jim came back and found Apache warriors at the cabin, it would mean war. Men would die, and it would be his fault. "My sister has told us something interesting," the brother continued. "She says that yesterday when the bad men wanted to take her, you refused. You chose to protect her even though it meant danger for you. Is this true?" "Yes," Tom said. "Why did you do this?" Tom struggled to find the right words. "Because she's a person, not property. Because selling her would have been as wrong as buying her was in the first place. Because she deserved better from me." The brother studied Tom's face for a long time. "You have done a terrible wrong to our people. Under normal circumstances, your life would be forfeit. But my sister speaks for you. She says your heart has changed." "What does that mean?" Tom asked. The brother smiled for the first time since arriving. "It means we are going to give you a chance to prove that her faith in you is justified. But first we must deal with the men who are coming to harm both of you." Tom looked around at the Apache warriors positioned around his cabin. These were men who knew this desert better than anyone. They were fighters who had been protecting their people from enemies for generations. For the first time since Big Jim's visit, Tom began to feel hope. But he also realized that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't even imagine. The Apache weren't just here to rescue Ayanna. They were here to test him, to see if he was worthy of the mercy they were considering showing him. The test was about to begin. The brother who told Tom his name was Cochise, named after the great Apache chief, explained the situation clearly. "The men who threatened you yesterday will return soon. When they do, they will find that things have changed." Tom watched as the Apache warriors took positions around his cabin. They moved like shadows, disappearing behind rocks and desert plants so completely that within minutes, Tom could barely see them even though he knew exactly where they were. "What's going to happen when Jim gets here?" Tom asked. Cochise looked toward the trail that led to town. "We will make it clear that the girl is under our protection now. The bad men will have a choice. They can leave peacefully, or they can face the consequences of their threats." This should have made Tom feel relieved, but instead it made him more worried. "If there's a fight, people will get hurt. The army will get involved. There could be a war over this." "You are concerned about war?" Cochise asked, seeming surprised. "I'm concerned that my mistakes will cause other people to suffer," Tom said. "This whole situation is my fault. I don't want anyone else to pay the price for what I did." Cochise translated this conversation for the other warriors. Their response seemed to surprise him. He spoke to Ayanna in Apache, and she nodded and responded at length. "My sister says this is exactly what she told us about you," Cochise said to Tom. "She says you have learned to think about consequences for other people, not just for yourself." Before Tom could respond, they heard horses approaching. Big Jim and his men were returning, just as they had promised. But this time Jim had brought 6 men instead of 3. They were all armed and ready for trouble. The Apache warriors remained hidden as Jim's group rode up to the cabin. Tom walked out to meet them, his heart pounding so hard he was sure everyone could hear it. "Morning, Mackenzie," Jim called out cheerfully. "I hope you spent last night saying goodbye to your Indian girl, because today she's coming with us." "Jim, we need to talk," Tom said, trying to keep his voice steady. Jim laughed and climbed down from his horse. His men spread out in a semicircle behind him. "The time for talking is over. You had your chance to pay me back like a man. Now I'm taking what I'm owed, plus interest." "She's not yours to take," Tom said. "And she's not yours to keep," Jim replied. "Boys, go get the girl." 2 of Jim's men started walking toward the cabin. That's when Cochise stepped out from behind a large boulder, his rifle pointed directly at them. "Stop," he said in clear English. The 2 men froze. Jim spun around and saw Cochise, then noticed the other Apache warriors as they revealed themselves from their hiding places. Within seconds, Jim and his men found themselves surrounded and outnumbered. "Well, well," Jim said, but his voice wasn't confident anymore. "Looks like Mackenzie has made some new friends." Cochise stepped closer. "The woman is Apache. She is under our protection. You will leave this place now and never return." Jim looked around at the warriors surrounding him. Tom could see him calculating odds and not liking what he found. But Jim was a proud man, and pride made men do stupid things. "I don't negotiate with Indians," Jim said loudly. "That girl was sold fair and square. She belongs to Mackenzie, and Mackenzie owes me money. That makes her mine now. No, Tom said firmly. She doesn't belong to anyone. She never did. That whole trade was wrong from the beginning. Jim stared at Tom in disbelief. You're siding with them against your own kind? I'm siding with what's right, Tom replied. For a moment, it looked like Jim might order his men to fight. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut. But even Jim wasn't stupid enough to start a gunfight when he was outnumbered 2-to-1 by Apache warriors who knew this terrain better than anyone. This isn't over. Mackenzie, Jim said as he climbed back onto his horse. You think you're safe out here with your Indian friends, but they won't always be around. And when they're gone, I'll be back. As Jim and his men rode away, Tom felt a mixture of relief and fear. The immediate danger was over, but Jim's threats were real. Tom knew that this confrontation had solved one problem, but created several others. Cochise watched the riders disappear, then turned to Tom. The immediate threat is gone, but that man spoke truth. We cannot protect you forever. Our people have our own battles to fight. I understand, Tom said. I never expected you to protect me at all. I'm grateful for what you did today. Do not be grateful yet, Cochise replied. Today was the easy part. Now comes the difficult choice. He gestured for Tom to sit down on a flat rock near the cabin. The other warriors gathered around in a circle. Ayanna sat beside her brother. Tom found himself in the center, feeling like he was on trial. You have admitted you're wrong, Cochise began. You have shown that your heart has changed. But words and feelings are not enough to balance the scales of justice. Tom nodded, understanding that this moment had been coming since the Apache first appeared. We offer you a choice, Cochise continued. You can leave this place now. Take your things and go far away, to a place where neither we nor the bad men can find you. Start a new life and forget this ever happened. What's the other choice? Tom asked. Cochise smiled grimly. The other choice is a test. You will go alone into the desert for 3 days with only basic supplies. You will use the skills my sister taught you to survive. If you succeed, we will consider your debt to our people partially paid. If you fail, he didn't need to finish the sentence. Tom understood. And if I pass this test, what then? Then we will discuss what comes next, Cochise said. But first, you must prove that the lessons you learned were real. That you can survive with the knowledge my sister gave you. Tom looked at Ayanna. She was watching him carefully, her dark eyes showing both concern and something else. Hope, maybe, or faith. I'll take the test, Tom said without hesitation. Several of the warriors seemed surprised by how quickly he made the decision. Cochise raised an eyebrow. You do not wish to think about this? The desert is not forgiving. Many men have died trying to survive alone out there. I've already done enough thinking, Tom said. If I'm going to prove that I've changed, then I need to prove it. Running away won't do that. Cochise stood up and walked to his horse. He returned with a small pack containing basic supplies. A water container, some dried meat, a knife, and a blanket. 3 days, he said. You will go south toward the Red Rocks. We will watch from a distance, but we will not help you. Your survival depends entirely on what you have learned. As Tom took the pack, Ayanna approached him. She reached into her dress and pulled out a small leather pouch. She placed it in his hands and spoke in Apache. She gives you medicine plants, Cochise translated. She says you will know how to use them when the time comes. Tom looked into Ayanna's eyes and saw something there that gave him courage. She believed he could do this. After everything he had put her through, she still had faith that he could become the man he needed to be. Thank you, he said to her in Apache, using words she had taught him. As Tom walked away from his cabin toward the red rocks in the distance, he carried with him more than just supplies for survival. He carried the weight of proving himself worthy of the mercy he had been shown, and the hope that 3 days in the desert would complete the transformation that had begun the moment he first saw Ayanna's intelligence and dignity. The test of his character was about to begin. The desert sun was already getting hot when Tom walked away from his cabin. He carried only the small pack Cochise had given him and the medicine pouch from Ayanna. Everything he had learned over the past weeks would now be put to the ultimate test. For the first few hours, Tom felt confident. He remembered Ayanna's lessons about walking efficiently, conserving energy, and reading the landscape for signs of water and shelter. He found a steady pace that didn't tire him too quickly, and he used rock formations to navigate toward the red cliffs in the distance. But as the day grew hotter, doubt began to creep in. The desert that had seemed manageable when he was learning from Ayana now felt vast and hostile. Every decision mattered. Which direction should he go? Where should he look for water? How much should he drink now versus saving it for later? By midday, the heat was brutal. Tom found shelter under a large rock overhang and waited for the sun to move lower in the sky. This was something Ayana had taught him. Never fight the desert during the hottest part of the day. Rest and conserve your strength. As he sat in the shade, Tom thought about everything that had led him to this moment. A month ago, he had been a desperate man who thought only about his own problems. Now he was risking his life to prove that he had learned to be something better. When evening came, Tom continued his journey. He found a sheltered spot among the rocks to spend the night, built a small fire using techniques Ayana had shown him, and ate a small portion of his dried meat. So far, so good. The second day was harder. Tom's water was running low, and he hadn't found a reliable source to refill his container. He remembered Ayana showing him signs to look for, certain plants that indicated underground water, rock formations that collected dew, places where animals came to drink. By afternoon, Tom was getting desperate. His lips were cracked, his mouth was dry, and his head was starting to pound. He was beginning to understand that this wasn't just a test of survival skills. It was a test of whether he could stay calm and think clearly when his life depended on it. That's when he remembered something Ayana had shown him. She had pointed out a particular type of cactus that stored water in its thick leaves. Tom had only half paid attention at the time, but now the lesson came back clearly. He found one of these cacti and carefully cut into it with his knife. Sweet, life-saving water dripped out. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep him going. Tom felt a surge of gratitude toward Ayana that was so strong it almost brought tears to his eyes. The second night was cold. The desert that burned during the day became freezing after dark. Tom wrapped himself in his blanket and huddled close to his small fire, but he still shivered until dawn. He was starting to understand why the Apache respected the desert so much. It was beautiful and dangerous, nurturing and deadly all at the same time. The third day brought Tom's greatest challenge. He woke up feeling weak and dizzy. His food was almost gone, and finding water was becoming harder. Worse, he was starting to lose his sense of direction. The landmarks that had seemed clear 2 days ago now looked confusing and unfamiliar. By midday, Tom was lost. He stood on top of a small hill, looking in all directions, and nothing looked familiar. Panic started to set in. If he chose the wrong direction, he could walk away from safety and die in the desert. If he chose right, he might make it back to prove himself worthy of the Apache's mercy. This was the moment when everything Ayana had taught him came together. Not just the practical skills, but the way of thinking she had demonstrated. Stay calm, observe carefully, think before acting. Tom sat down and forced himself to breathe slowly. He looked at the sun's position and remembered which direction he had been traveling. He studied the rock formations and began to recognize patterns he had seen before. Slowly, carefully, he pieced together where he was and which way he needed to go. But the effort of staying calm and thinking clearly in a crisis had taken something out of him. As the afternoon wore on, Tom felt himself getting weaker. His steps became unsteady. His vision started to blur. That evening, as Tom tried to build a fire with shaking hands, he experienced something unexpected. All the events of the past month came flooding back to him with crystal clarity. He saw himself making that terrible trade with the Mexican, desperate and thinking only of his own problems. He remembered Ayana's frightened face that first night in his cabin, but he also remembered her patience as she taught him to survive. He remembered her dignity in an impossible situation. He remembered the moment when he chose to protect her from Big Jim, even though it meant danger for himself. Sitting alone in the vast desert, Tom understood that this test wasn't really about proving himself to the Apache. It was about proving something to himself. He needed to know that the changes he felt inside were real, that he really had become someone different than the man who had bought another human being out of desperation and selfishness. The desert had stripped away everything unnecessary. Out here there were no excuses, no distractions, no one else to blame. There was just Tom and the consequences of every choice he made. In this harsh environment, he had to face the truth about who he really was. The realization gave him strength he didn't know he had. Even though his body was tired and weak, his mind became clearer. He successfully built his fire, found enough water to last the night, and even managed to catch a small lizard for extra food. On the morning of the fourth day, Tom saw smoke rising in the distance. It was coming from the direction of his cabin. He had found his way home. As he walked the last mile back to his cabin, Tom felt like a completely different person than the one who had left 3 days earlier. The desert had tested every skill Ayanna had taught him, but more than that, it had tested his character. It had forced him to confront who he was and who he wanted to become. When his cabin came into view, Tom saw Cochise and Ayanna waiting for him. They had been watching from a distance, just as Cochise had promised. As Tom approached, he could see relief in Ayanna's face and something like approval in her brother's. Tom had passed the test. But as he was about to discover, this was not the end of his journey. It was just the beginning of a new chapter in a life that had been forever changed by his encounter with a remarkable Apache woman who had taught him that true strength comes from wisdom, patience, and the courage to do what is right. Tom walked into the camp on unsteady legs, his face sunburned and his clothes torn from 3 days in the harsh desert. But his eyes were clear and determined. Cochise studied him carefully, looking for signs of what the test had revealed about Tom's character. "You have returned," Cochise said simply. "I have," Tom replied. "And I understand now why you sent me out there." Ayanna approached with a cup of water and some food. Tom accepted them gratefully, but what meant more to him was the look in her eyes. She seemed proud of what he had accomplished, and that approval meant everything to him. Over the next hour, Tom told Cochise and the other warriors about his 3 days alone. He described how he had used Ayanna's teachings to find water, shelter, and food. But more importantly, he talked about what he had learned about himself during the long, difficult hours in the wilderness. "The desert taught me something I never understood before," Tom explained. "It showed me that everything is connected. Every choice has consequences that go far beyond what we can see. When I bought Ayanna, I was only thinking about my immediate problem. I never considered what it would mean for her or for her family or for anyone else." Cochise nodded approvingly. "The desert is a good teacher for those who are willing to learn. But I have another confession to make," Tom continued. "I know now that passing your test isn't enough. What I did was so wrong that I need to spend the rest of my life trying to make up for it, and I want to do that if you'll let me." This statement surprised several of the warriors. They had expected Tom to be eager to put this whole experience behind him and move on with his life. Instead, he was asking for the chance to dedicate himself to making amends. Cochise spoke with Ayanna and the other warriors in Apache. The conversation was long and serious. Tom waited patiently, understanding that his entire future was being decided in a language he couldn't understand. Finally, Cochise turned back to him. "My sister and our elders have discussed your situation. We have a proposal for you, but it is not what you might expect." Tom listened carefully as Cochise explained the Apache perspective. The desert region was changing rapidly. More settlers were arriving every month. The army was building new forts. Conflicts between Apache people and newcomers were becoming more frequent and more violent. "Most white men do not understand our ways," Cochise said, "and most of our people do not understand theirs. This leads to fear, and fear leads to violence. Many people on both sides die because of misunderstandings that could be avoided." "What does this have to do with me?" Tom asked. "You are a white man who has learned to see Apache people as human beings," Cochise replied. "You have lived with my sister and learned from her. You understand both worlds now. This makes you valuable in a way that few men are." Cochise went on to explain that the Apache were looking for someone who could serve as a bridge between the two cultures, someone who could help prevent the kinds of misunderstandings that led to violence and suffering on both sides. "We offer you the chance to establish a trading post," Cochise said. "Not like the stores in town that cheat our people and sell them whiskey that makes them sick. A place where Apache and white people can meet safely and trade fairly. A place where both sides can learn that the other is made up of human beings, not monsters." Tom was stunned. "You want me to become a trader?" "We want you to become a bridge," Ayanna said in English. Over the weeks, her English had improved dramatically. "You help people understand each other. You stop fear from becoming hate." The idea was both terrifying and exciting. Tom would be giving up any chance of returning to his old life. But his old life had been empty and selfish anyway. This new path offered the chance to do something meaningful with the years he had left. There would be rules, Cochise warned. You would never sell weapons or whiskey to anyone. You would treat all people fairly, regardless of their skin color. You would use your position to promote understanding, not profit. And you would remember always that this opportunity comes from the mercy my sister showed you, not from anything you earned yourself. Tom thought about this offer for a long time. It would be dangerous work. Both Apache and white people would be suspicious of him. He would be caught between two worlds, trusted completely by neither, but it was also a chance to spend his life working toward something good, instead of just surviving day to day. I accept, Tom said finally. I'll do whatever I can to make this work. Over the next few months, with help from Cochisi's band and a few open-minded settlers, Tom established his trading post at a crossroads between Apache territory and the growing towns. It was a simple place, just a large building with supplies and space for people to meet and talk. At first, business was slow. White settlers were afraid to trade with Indians, and Apache people were suspicious of any white man. But gradually, word spread that Tom's place was different. He never cheated anyone. He took time to explain Apache customs to white visitors, and white customs to Apache visitors. He helped people solve problems instead of just taking their money. Ayanna visited the trading post regularly. She had returned to live with her people, as was proper, but she continued to serve as Tom's teacher and advisor. Their relationship had evolved into something that was part friendship, part business partnership, and part continuing education. You have learned much, she told Tom one day as they watched Apache and white children playing together outside the trading post. But you still have much more to learn. I hope so, Tom replied. I hope I never stop learning. Years passed. The trading post became known throughout the territory as a place where people could meet safely across cultural lines. Tom helped prevent several conflicts by facilitating communication between Apache leaders and Army officers. He assisted Apache families in finding fair prices for their crafts and helped white settlers understand how to live more successfully in the desert environment. The work was exactly as challenging as Cochise had warned. Tom was criticized by white people who thought he was too sympathetic to Indians, and by Apache people who thought he was still fundamentally loyal to his own race. He walked a careful line every day, trying to build trust on both sides while never forgetting the lesson that had started his transformation. One evening, as Tom sat outside his trading post watching the desert sunset, he reflected on how dramatically his life had changed. 5 years earlier, he had been a failed prospector whose biggest concern was his gambling debts. Now he was a man with a purpose, doing work that mattered in the world. The transformation had started with a terrible mistake, but it had led him to discover who he truly wanted to be. Tom never forgot that his opportunity for redemption had come at a great cost to Ayanna and her family. He carried that responsibility with him every day, using it as motivation to be worthy of the mercy he had been shown. Ayanna had taught him that every person has the capacity to change and grow. The desert had taught him that survival depends on understanding your environment and respecting the forces around you. Together, these lessons had given him a new life built on service, understanding, and the daily choice to do what was right instead of what was easy. As the stars appeared in the desert sky, Tom felt grateful for the chain of events that had brought him to this moment. His life had been forever changed by a transaction that should never have happened, and a woman whose wisdom and strength had saved him from becoming someone he could never have lived with being. The story of Tom Mackenzie became a legend in the Arizona territory, told around campfires and in saloons as an example of how people can change when they find the courage to confront their own mistakes. But for Tom himself, it was simply the story of how he learned to be human,